la famille.
Thank you, John. We're very happy to have you here, even a few hours before the game, and for a discussion with John. So I'd ask a few questions for about 40 minutes, and then we'll invite our guests to join and ask questions as well. And then we can leave you, go back to your family and see the game, watch the game. So let's start maybe just with football, because this is a very special day, as you can guess. You're from the only country in the world in which football is not the religion that it is in the rest of the world. So how do you view that? Did you learn football because you to interact better with French people, or were you already familiar with with that back in the US?
No, I played every sport imaginable, and I wasn't real good at any of them, but I loved them. So I played American football, basketball, tennis, swimming, baseball, and all the above, but my generation did not play soccer. I coached my kids soccer, however, and did it for multiple years, both my daughter and my son. And I realized then that we were one generation away from before we would begin to get competitive with the Europeans and the Latin American soccer players. And so I loved the sport, but it was not one that I grew up in, and I loved it because my kids loved it.
Okay. So it's a bit like startups. You need several generations before the ecosystem takes off. And
exactly. Your coaches have to be people who've played before, and then your next generation coaches have to be coaches who were really good before, and then maybe we'll get more competitive and be able to even make it into the playoffs, much less have a chance at finishing higher. So our women do better than our guys. So.
Okay. So maybe, John, I thought we'd also start by talking about your life, your career, and your background. Most people here, I guess, know you as the former CEO of Cisco. How did you end up being the CEO of Cisco? And what is Cisco, by the way? Because as we discussed it before, it's a brand that is extremely familiar for everyone working in tech. Yeah. But if you ask anyone to explain what Cisco does exactly, most people are unable to do that. So maybe as part of the background, could you explain us?
I'll try to explain it also in a way that is very relevant to startups and the stages you will go through. I never intended to be in technology. I went to college for 9.5 years. I have a whole bunch of degrees and a very understanding wife who's my high school sweetheart. And I intended to come out of law school and MBA school and a couple years of engineering, going to do mergers and acquisitions of big companies. And a friend had 2 tickets to a basketball game if I'd interview at IBM. And I said, sure, and ended up joining technology. I like technology, but I love what technology can do. And there's an important learning for me. I've always focused on the outcome and the benefits of what technology can do. And that's the way I've always sold it and determined where I invest. So I went straight out of school to IBM. I went from IBM to Wang Laboratories. I went from Wang Laboratories to Cisco. And it's important to watch, those were 3 different high-tech generations: mainframes, mini computers, and then to the internet. And as those changes occurred, the power within the US moved from Boston, which used to be the Silicon Valley of the world, Route 128, to all the companies are gone. And Silicon Valley became powerful. So there's no entitlement in high tech. Now in the new generations, it's moving faster. How did I end up at Cisco? When Wang Laboratories began to come apart and Dr. Wang died, who was a very good friend of mine, I felt that our future was not good, and I didn't want to continue doing layoffs. And I managed 10,000 people there. But I wanted to go where the future was. And so I looked in Silicon Valley, and something that's very important to each of you, the reason I got the job at Cisco had nothing to do with me sending out my resume and then give me a response back. When I left Wang, I thought I would send out my resume and I'd immediately get a bunch of offers because my track record was really good in sales. I got 0 offers back. And out of the end, I was working 22 job opportunities that I got offers in. 21 were through networking and friends. And I'd already been presented by the headhunters to Oracle and to several other companies that gave me offers, so the headhunter was not going to present me to Cisco. And because of how I treated somebody almost 10 years before who was at Cisco and knew that I was in the market, he called me up and said, "You should be our next CEO." And that's how I got the job at Cisco, was the introduction for that. But again, it was a transition. I understood PCs, I understood the internet, and different than most people who thought about this as just something geeks would do among universities, I thought it would change the world. And I said that in 1992, that Cisco would change the world as the internet would, and how you work, live, play, and learn. So again, focused on outcomes.
How it is to arrive in a company to become the CEO. You don't really know the organization yet. You don't have many friends maybe within the organization. How do you take over such a large organization? And I guess with people reflecting on who are you?
Yeah. Well, you take it over very carefully, because they were a very successful router company with 400 people and 70 million in sales. And I had the good fortune to take it from 400 people and 70 million in sales to 75,000 people and 48 billion in sales. And so you come in, you learn the culture, you learn the people, you learn your customers, you learn your technology. And then as you learn that, after about 90, 120 days, then I outlined what the future of our company could be. So it's classic what the CEOs in this room do. You only do 4 jobs as CEO: vision and strategy for your company, retain, develop, recruit, and change the leadership team to implement that vision and strategy. Culture, which most young startups do not understand. Culture is as important as strategy. I've never seen a great company without a very strong culture. You may or may not like the culture at an Uber or a Cisco or a Microsoft, but there are always strong cultures on it. And then the fourth element, which is even more important in today's times, is communication. Communication to the external world, shareholders, customers, employees, partners, etc. on that. So your 4 jobs are that. So then I outlined the strategy of where our company needed to go. I began to make very bold moves on how to get there. When I acquired the first company and paid $92 million for a company with $10 million in revenue, my stock went down. My board of directors were very nervous because all high-tech acquisitions fail. At that time. And we rewrote the textbook on how to do acquisitions. I did 180 of them, 12 of which were over $1 billion acquisition. I could get a call on a Thursday night about a company I didn't know from a person I respected, and my competitor's about to buy this company, and I'd have my team in on Friday morning. I'd be there by noon. We'd do a $3 billion handshake. We'd have it through both board of directors and announce on a Monday. No company in the world can do that. And this goes back to process. I used to think process was bureaucracy, and I was really wrong. Process is the way that allows you to move with tremendous speed if you can make it replicatable on it. So what Cisco was a combination of really cool technologies, routing and switching and virtualization, etc., and convergence of data, voice, video over single IP infrastructure. But what it was to me was it was going to change every business in the world and change how you do business. And instead of entering orders online and handling it by people and doing your customer support through people, we put all that over the internet. We could close our books in 24 hours anytime we want, and that gives you tremendous financial advantage, but it allows you also to be able to see a problem coming and fix it before your quarter comes on. And today, almost no company in the world can close their books in 24 hours. We did it 20 years ago. We unfortunately invented outsourcing of manufacturing because it's a context to us, not a core capability. And so we did a lot of things that really set the trend for how to use the internet. We called it Cisco on Cisco, which I encourage you to do for your own products. The more you can use them, the more effective you are in being able to get people to understand them. So for today, with the defense minister, who's really good, by the way, I showed her 2 products that were startups that I was involved in, and one was a very secure phone, and the other one was a drone capability on top of my house to see drones anywhere in the area, to be able to anticipate where they're coming from, what were their serial numbers, etc. And almost no military bases in the world can do this, and I can do it off my house. But I do it because I use my own products and are able to articulate it.
So you're right that Cisco is well known for acquiring a lot of companies. It's something that's lacking here in Europe. We don't have many large companies acquiring startups, which creates many problems. It creates liquidity problems for venture capital firms and many other problems. So you mentioned the playbook. So what's the playbook? How could you sum it up in maybe just a few words?
So in the sequence you ask it.
In other words, what could you teach to our corporate executives here in Europe so that they buy more companies?
Or teach to you, if a company tries to buy you, should you say yes or no? And your temptation will be to say yes based on the money, and that's the disaster. So the rules are, when you start to do something no one else has done, to think you're going to be smarter and how to execute them is naive. So the minute I decided to do acquisitions, I then studied why did everybody else fail, and what were we going to do differently. And then I got this innovation playbook on how we're going to execute, which I designed myself with my team's input. And to this day, 25 years later, we still follow the same playbook. And it is the playbook taught at Harvard, Stanford. It's the one that Oracle uses to follow it, etc. So when you decide to acquire a company, first, it's much harder than you think, and 90% of acquisitions fail. So you have to go in with that mentality. That if failure means, was it a failure for the acquired company? Did you keep the people you acquired? Did you get the next generation product out? Was it a good deal for your shareholders? And et cetera. So it starts with, if your company and the company you're acquiring, or vice versa, you're the acquired company and the company you're selling to, if you don't have a similar vision of how the industry is going to play out for the segment you're in, and what is the win for both organizations in that, you shouldn't do the deal. The second, and this might surprise you, understand what you're acquiring and you protect it at all costs. So when a financial company buys another financial company, like Nations Bank buying Bank of America, they were not buying people, they were buying customers and geography. So they protect that at all costs, and candidly, most of the leaders were gone out of Bank of America. When we acquire a company, we're purely acquiring the people to build the next generation product. And if I don't keep the engineers and the top leaders for that next generation product, it's going to be a financial disaster for me. So when a company is acquired in our industry in Silicon Valley, the turnover rate on the acquired company over the next 4 years is 20% per year, voluntary attrition. Guess what my attrition runs at Cisco for acquired companies? Anybody want to take a guess? 4%. And in the Valley, the turnover of normal companies is 12 to 14% a year. So I acquire talent and I keep it. So I can acquire a Crescendo for crazy price of $92 million and make it a $13 billion revenue stream for us. You can buy a Meraki for a run rate of $100 million and pay $3 billion for it, and people thought we'd made a mistake. And within 2 years, it was a run rate of $1 billion. And so it is how you get that replicatable fashion. So similar vision and strategy of the market. It is a culture that is similar. It's got to be material because it's going to be hard. I don't acquire. If the culture is different than mine, I walk, no matter how good the financial deal is. And then you've got to report them into the right functions to keep the people on it. It's almost always customer driven. My customers tell me who to acquire. I just need to know how to ask them on that. And the question is very simple. If you really like the company, think I should acquire it, will you do more business with them and with me if I acquire them? If the answer is not yes, I don't do the deal on it. Geographic proximity is huge. If you acquire companies all over the world and you don't have centers there, you can't realign your resource and move them around. So it's a series of steps, and then we're like a machine. We can execute, as I said, in 72 hours, what most people can't do in 4 or 5 months.
So in that process, so acquiring a lot of startups, you've interacted with many, many CEOs, and now you've moved on and you've become a mentor, advisor, and investor in startups. So what's your day job today? How do you work with those younger CEOs? What do you teach them?
So in the sequence you raised the question, I had the rare opportunity to help change the world with the internet. And it is exciting, and we did. And I think most people would give Cisco credit with being synonymous with the internet. When I originally started, I got complaints about my Cisco truck drivers. That was Cisco, the food firm. And I knew that we'd finally arrived when I quit getting those letters. But we had the chance to change the world once. With artificial intelligence and digitization, a number of you are working on that, we will destroy 25 to 35% of the jobs that exist today. It's going to happen. Large companies will not add headcount here in France or around the world in total over the next decade, and a large number will be destroyed job-wise. If we don't get the startup engine going much faster, and if we don't get it going not just in France, but in the 12 major regions within France, in the US, not in Silicon Valley or in the Northeast, but across all 50 states, you're going to have social problems, you're going to have income divide, and technology will move to being the bad guys. So I think I know how to change that. It's about how do you probably triple the number of startups we're doing and scale them faster using today's terms to unicorns, et cetera. So to help do that as a model, I'm doing that with my own venture arm, but I'm spatial purpose driven. I'm into 14 companies today on that. I have 2 that are already unicorn and 2 that will be in the next 18 months, barring a surprise. Then I looked at where were the examples in the world that could be the model for the rest of the world, and it would not be the US. There's no entitlement in this new area. We used to get 90% of the venture capital in the US 20 years ago. 10 years ago, only 80% of the venture capital went in the US. Guess what it is today? 53%. We used to have 61% of the world's unicorns 4 years ago. We have 41%. During the 90s, when Cisco, I had the opportunity to run the company, on the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange, over 700 companies were taken public in 1996. Today it's only 200. Now what you see in France is the exact reverse. When I had a chance to get involved in France, my friend said, come over and invest in France, and John, help us grow. And I said, I love the people in France, I love the food, and it's a great place to take my wife, but I'm not going to put resources there. And they said, come and listen. I said, no. They said, go to the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. So I'm a pattern recognition guy. So I went, and there were 66 French companies there. This was 3.5 years ago. And the year before, when I sat down in a room even smaller than this with the 66 companies and went through what they do in Q&A, I thought I was in Silicon Valley, except they had French accents. And you'll get used to my sense of humor. It'll grow on you. But they were really good. So I said, how many were there the year before? They said 38. 38, 66. I get this. Next year, 128. Year after that, 178. This last year in January, 274. The U.S. only had 280. So all it took me was 1 year to realize the trend was there. Then I came and talked to the businesses here in France. Then I talked to the government leaders. And I didn't think I was going to get along with them. They were socialists, and I didn't think like business, and weren't interested. And it was the reverse. They basically understood the country had to change. They sensed there was a change occurring with the young people. They were willing to a digital contract with Cisco to digitize the country together, and no other country in the world of that size would have done that at that time, except Israel, much smaller, did it a couple years before that. And they said they knew to make this go, we had to become the startup engine of Europe. So I said, and I really believed it before almost anybody in the world did, that France would become the startup leader in Europe, even though it hadn't been known for innovation or startups before. And as you all know, you did that in less than 3 years. And so that's how I got involved in France. And then when Macron, who I got to know very well as economic minister, and I got the honor of teaching classes with him in MBA school and doing press releases together, and he came to my house to meet startups in Silicon Valley and venture capitalists to see what occurred there. And then when he offered the chance to really make a difference in France beyond just being a good example, I had to say yes. It was an honor. And it took courage. Can you imagine America appointing a French leader or a German leader head of high tech for America? I mean, that was the courage this man had. And I think you're all very blessed to have him personally, and I think he'll lead this country in a very good way.
And so, talking about France, what are the so you have, I guess, a few entrepreneurs here who will ask questions in a minute.
Okay.
What are the shortcomings that you're seeing in France? What do we have to change to make better?
So first, I think it's important. The French people, I think you're harder on yourself than any other nation in the world. And so I'm a pattern guy, and your trends are all going the right way. So my first advice to you is don't mess it up. And you're different than every other country in Europe. No other country is going 130 venture capital-backed investments per year to 740. It's the fastest growing in the world. Your engineering schools are moving from producing engineers who go into government or big companies to producing engineers who become startups. The imagination of your young people have got it, and you have governments who believe in this being the future of the country and know that if they don't do it with inclusion and diversity and gender diversity as well, the country will miss this window forever. And unfortunately, your European counterparts are mis-executing. Italy is in real trouble. The UK is lost. And Germany, who used to lead in innovation moving fast, is moving remarkably slow. So I believe France will be the innovation gateway for Europe. I think we'll become the startup nation, but I think you'll be the model for the rest of Europe. So there's the positives. What's missing? We're missing the role models. You have great companies, but they're big companies that have been big for decades. And in the US, we have companies that are great and big, but they've come in the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and you can learn from them, but you can also steal the talent from them. And that's what really makes the Valley grow, is generation after generation of talent moving from the big companies into the smaller, doing the next generation, reinventing big to small. And that's the reason Boston 128 failed, is the Wangs, the Decks, the Data Generals, which were the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons of that generation. We did not move our people into startups. We were very inwardly looking as opposed to expertly looking for it. So the first thing is we've got to develop generations of people that know how to scale companies. And we've got to develop talent that can help you scale where the talent isn't doing it for the first time. And that's going to slow us down a little bit. The second is we have labor laws and freelance employee capability that have to be changed for this new environment to look at it. The third is we are getting much better at growing companies and starting them, but we only got 2 unicorns. And out of 14 investments in the US, I've already got 2, and I've got 2 that will get there in the next 18 months. And the reason I focus on unicorns, that's where the job creation occurs. That's where you get a Facebook adding 10,000 people a year to Silicon Valley. And so getting more unicorns involved in it. So how do you take this good generation of startups, and I think the number of startups have to triple, so don't misunderstand me. It has to ramp, and what you are doing here, I think, is a good example of helping that ramp. But we have to do a much better job of scaling these companies and not going flat at a lower rate. And so I think the unicorn issue is there. And then I think the government has to even move faster to make this understood that the average citizen in France will benefit from this, not just a few elitists. At Cisco, take a guess out of employees. How many millionaires do you think I helped to make the first 10 years at Cisco? Out of our employees. 100? 1,000? 10,000. So we shared the wealth. And it's the best way to grow a company is to do it as a team. And so this isn't a issue where the average person doesn't participate. In fact, in the Valley, we don't care what sex you are, your sexual orientation, male, female, your religion, color of your skin. If you're good, we're going to love you. And if you're not, we kind of ignore you. And so it is purely based upon your ability to execute. And with tremendous respect, when you go into the top restaurants there, guess who gets the window seats? Not the government leaders or the CEOs, it's the top engineers. And we really treat the startups as almost a religion in terms of it, with a great deal of admiration.
And do you think that in France or in Europe in general, the large old incumbents are a problem for startups? Is it because of those old companies that are extremely strong and resilient that we have a harder time growing startups here?
No, it's a very good question. It might be an issue in the US where you have the big guys like Amazon and Google and Facebook that may slow companies' ability to move into the market, but your problem's the reverse. You do not have the incumbent high-tech players. And remember, every company in the world will become a technology company. Doesn't matter if you're in retail, banking, government, healthcare, transportation, whatever, you will move to become a technology company with an expertise in a given industry. Our problem is we don't have the incumbents that help us get there and help provide the resources and the training. There's been a fundamental change in your large enterprise companies here in Europe in the last 2 years. No, in France in the last 2 years. 2 to 3 years ago, only a few of your large companies would do business with startups. And the reason was the risk of failure is fairly high, and it's not part of the French culture to take that risk. The US is the reverse. And at Cisco, we were unbelievably high very early in our implementation. The 2 artificial intelligence companies that I've invested in now that are moving, they call it the CEO level of Fortune 500 companies, and they get the order. And they're ramping at a speed like from one of them from 1 million to 50 million this year. So a 50-fold increase. We have to get the same mentality here in France. And so you're suddenly seeing the Thaleses of the world, the Axes of the world, the Postal Service, which is one of the most progressive in the world here, having startups get involved. And we're going to encourage them to get more involved, because that's the reason many of the companies leave France, is your market isn't big enough, especially if the large companies don't buy from you. And so getting the companies to say this is part of the right thing for France, it's also good for them, because you will bring innovative ideas at a faster pace than they could do internally. And so the CEOs are starting to realize this isn't just right for the country, it's also going to be good for them in terms of innovation. So that's starting to change. But what is missing is we don't have the role models. And it's why so many of the companies in this room, as you're successful, there's places where the startups break. You break at 10 million in revenue, you break at 100 million in revenue, you break at 500 million in revenue, and $1 billion. And the reason is because you have to change your leadership style. You have to move from selling products to selling outcomes. You've got to, instead of being engineering driven, become sales and engineering driven. You've got to get your channels right, etc. And so getting people that know how to do that also becomes a very important part. That's what I'm trying to do, to say how do we replicate it, and trying to also lead with example both here in France and the US and in India on doing it with companies that I can show and say, look at how many unicorns we built, look at these others, and then kind of teach it.
So you talked about the US going down as a startup powerhouse. There's not much in Europe at the moment, but there's a lot happening in Asia, and especially in China, and more in India as well, or Southeast Asia as well. What can we learn from them? Because we're used to learning from the US, you're the big brother that we look up to, and we can read you in English and learn a lot from you in English. Whereas when we turn to China, it's all in Mandarin, so nobody understands a word. And it's very difficult to know what's really going on the ground. So as you've worked there, and you've worked with Chinese business people quite a lot, I guess, so what do they have to teach us?
So in the sequence we went on, first, don't count out the US. We'll be back, and we always are. And part of what I want to do is use France and India as an example of what the US should do. And we still have, 53% of the world's venture capital sounds bad in trends, it's still a big number. And once we decide to do something, we do it on scale and rapidly. And so I think the U.S. will be a great partner for Europe and for France as we move forward. What can we learn from Asia? I was with Wang Laboratories. It was truly a mini computer company that was Chinese. Dr. Wang was my friend and my sponsor in the company, and I went through multiple jobs, including running Asia Pacific for Dr. Wang, and I ran China. And I was the only Caucasian to ever run China in Wang's history. And he trusted me that much to understand it. I understood the Chinese culture. I surrounded myself with people that the Chinese trusted. Their president, Jiang Zemin, was Dr. Wang's classmate, so I got to do things in China no American could do. And I did the first joint venture in China. When I sold my mini computer systems, I couldn't take it out in cash, so I took it out in Rhodesia's, Zimbabwe's, if you will, tobacco, and sold the tobacco on it. I realized from the beginning the Chinese would become a high-tech powerhouse because everyone that had the Wang manuals, they were reading those, even they had nothing to do with mini computers. And I knew that their thousands of years of entrepreneurship would blossom. So China is a huge high-tech powerhouse now, coming on scale with the U.S. Lately, they've lost the way a little bit in terms of creating a win-win with their global power peers. I hope that gets corrected. The country that I'm betting on heaviest now in Asia is, and I bet on China in 1995 at Cisco. So I bet on China before almost any other high-tech firm did, and it worked out real well for us. But the company I'm now betting country is India. Modi really gets it. It was fun watching your president meet with Modi, and I was part of the French delegation when we went there, even though I knew as many or more of the Indian business leaders and government leaders. But they're going to be the fastest growing economy in the world for this next decade, barring a surprise. And they'll be the fastest growing in large part because of Modi's plan to digitize the country and build a startup engine. So their question is, can they grow at 7% GDP growth per year or 10? Yeah. Now, think what that means to the citizens. If you grow at 7% per year, you double the per capita income every 10 years. You grow at 10, you double the per capita income every 7 years. That's the opportunity in front of them. They have to create 1.2 million jobs a month. So the startup engine has to do it at a scale that hasn't been done before, and it's an honor to work with Prime Minister Modi as an advisor to him and the Indian people on how to do that.
Maybe one last question is your role as an ambassador for French tech, or working with the French government to help the French ecosystem thrive. What should these entrepreneurs expect from you as an ambassador for French tech, and maybe how can they help you do your job better? What can you expect from them?
Great question. So one of the things that I want you to focus on as entrepreneurs, you want to be able to summarize your company's strategy and your role as a leader within the company very crisply on what you do and don't do. And it will shock you how many high-tech CEOs I sit down with startups and say, all right, give me your 3-minute elevator pitch, and then tell me what you do as CEO. And they stumble through it. So it's very important, if you're going to lead a company, to have good communication skills, crisp articulation of your vision and strategy and what you do. So what I do as French Tech Ambassador, number one, is help develop the startup engine in France. How do you develop the engine? How do you scale the engine? How do you create more unicorns? How do you create the jobs from it? Number two is, how do you attract money to France, investment, venture capitalists to France in the country, and how do we do that at a much faster pace and bigger scale? And number three is represent French tech, regardless of size, on a global basis. I do all the above. So this week I spoke down at the Economic and Social Conference talking about how large companies need to use startups to help to get them innovation. I will speak in I did 4 individual startup meetings this morning, really good. I did 1 of your 2 unicorn meetings last night. I will meet with you all today. I'm meeting with 5 to 7 potential unicorns tomorrow. I'm teaching a startup master class tomorrow for 100. That's the type of thing I do. On Friday, I'll be meeting with your Business France lead, Pascal, and I will call on 15 Silicon Valley companies about investing in France, outlining a vision of where France is going, asking them to come and visit us in December and see what the startup engine is like here. Talk to your president, who's your best salesperson in the world for your country, on it. And then representing high tech, like I did 2 months ago in India, for here's what France's startups could be, and France's high tech startups do it as well.
Thank you for all that. Maybe it's time to invite our guests to ask questions as well. So.
Yeah, so you talked a lot about the emergence of the ecosystem, the innovation economy here in France and in India with Modi, and the role that he's played and the role that Macron's played here in France. I think you're also pretty involved in a tech advocacy organization in the United States with my boss, actually, TechNet. And that's been around for quite some time. And so I'm curious, sort of the lessons that you've learned with that organization as governments change, as economies change, as public perception of technology and innovation changes. Are there anything that you would sort of caution or warn or try to teach France about sustaining that innovation and that momentum and that enthusiasm about innovation over time?
So several things. John Doerr from Kleiner Perkins and I founded TechNet over 20 years ago because technology was growing in the country, yet we ignored Washington. And when we did go to visit the politicians, we flew in, told them they were messed up, and flew out, which doesn't get any desirable behavior at all. And governments can enable technology, or they can really make it almost impossible to be successful. So we realized we needed to come together as a group to be able to get the important issues in front of government, and very often on very delicate topics. If one company went in and talked to them, a startup or a big company, you could put in the penalty box for saying what you're doing is wrong for American people and wrong for job creation. But when you move as a community, you can be successful. So the ability to move as a community in high tech, I think, is important for France to do, and to take what MEDEF did with small business and to have a French high tech community that works together, I think is important to do. That's one of the key lessons learned. What you want to do is to continue to reinvent yourself, both with the people leading that group and the age of the group as you move forward.
Hello, my name is Mathieu. You were talking about the 20% of the jobs who will disappear in 10 years. What do you think about the idea of universal salary? Universal salary or compensation for everyone without
So
working.
the one thing you're going to find out you like about me or don't like about me is I will be very direct. I think it is a huge mistake. In the U.S., Silicon Valley didn't know what it did to the rest of the country. We thought we knew better than the rest of the country, and we had some of our top leaders saying, no problem, if we destroy your job, we'll guarantee you a universal salary. No one in West Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio wants to get a salary for not doing a job. They want a meaningful job for their kids and their family. And this is where high tech became arrogant, elitist, and out of touch. So there's a real worry, and it's very valid, that high tech will be moved from being the good guys with the white hat to the bad guys who destroy jobs and are out of touch with the rest of our country and the rest of the world. And so this is something you have to be very careful of here. Now, France may have a little bit different approach to it, but we in high tech should not, in my opinion, move to the point of saying we're going to solve your problem for the jobs we destroy, not by creating new jobs, but giving you a given out income. And by the way, where's that income going to come from if you don't do new jobs? You can't do raises unless you literally put more people to work in higher paying opportunities. So I know that's may or may not be a point you agree with, but when you ask me a question, I'll answer it as candidly as I can.
Okay, thank you.
Do you agree or disagree with it?
I agree also with you.
I thought you were going to nail me the other way.
Yeah, so I got a question because you talk a lot about like government, startups, organization in France, but I think there are some people missing. which is the VC in France, because we've raised funds for our company, and we've talked to VC in France, VC in the US, VC in China, and definitely there is some differences between the way VC work in terms of valuation, the vesting. I mean, it's might sound basics, but just the way VC, especially in Paris, they see startups, they still have this idea they need to control the company. So I just wanted to know if you also share your experience with French VC.
Sure. So the VC's primary role is to get a good financial return for their organization. So anytime you interface to a group, and President Clinton taught me this in the US, is you want to understand the audience you're speaking to and what's on their mind first and what is their definition of success. The second issue is that we don't have enough VCs in Paris and in France to scale the organization, and that's part of my role, but it's really the role of France as a country and you all to create the right environment so we bring more VCs in, and first there'll be more money, but also more competition. Third is you all as a CEO and as a startup will really determine diversity. My generation did not do a good job on this. At Cisco, we had 30% of our board female before the number 30% even came up. And I had 30% of my leadership team female before people even started talking about it. But if you watch, and Sheryl Sandberg with Leaning In, she's a very good friend of mine and we're very close. But the numbers have stalled, both in number of female CEOs and in tech companies at about 24%. And number of female CEOs are actually going down. And so diversity is something that I hope you will solve, and I think you'll solve it for a different reason. I think your generation is more comfortable with diversity and understanding diverse teams always out-execute look-alike teams. And secondly, as you grow, you can really scale. And I'd give you one thing to consider as a best practice. And I always practice something first out of sight in case it doesn't work, then it doesn't haunt me later. So we tried this with one of our startups in India, where all we did was require for each open position, you interview at least one diverse person, one female, etc. And it didn't matter how many you hired or not, you just had to interview one. In 1 year, 14 months, the diversity numbers on gender went from 23% in the company to 34%. Now, VCs aren't going to tell you to do that, nor is it really their job. They might give you an indication, but really your generation can say how diverse should your workforce be and how do you lead by example and perhaps do something that my generation did not. And you'll find it's also really good for business. So it's the right thing to do, and it's also just good for business on diverse teams. But that's not the job of the VC. It's the job of you all, if I can be very direct. And I hope you fix something my generation just maybe did a C job on.
Hello. I've met a lot of, you spoke about culture, and I think culture is very important when you're talking about a company. And I've been meeting a lot of agile coaches lately, and they tell me they have so much trouble with their companies or their team being understood by CEOs. And that CEO would want the innovation to happen in France and their companies, but then when trouble comes, they want to fall back into the old style. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, for me, this is fun. And maybe I'll be a better person in my next life, but I don't think so. I love to compete. And the minute I get my competitors looking out the rearview mirror and falling back or doing acquisitions without knowing how to do it, I've got them. And so this is a new world that's going to move at the pace that went from 21 years to 14 to 7 in terms of market cap. The next generation will be 3 to 4 years. And if you make a mistake of falling back to your old way of doing things, you probably will never recover. You might have short-term reward from shareholders or your venture capital, etc. But this is a market where you disrupt or you get disrupted. It's not a zero-sum game, however. It will raise the boats, all of them, that really do this transition well. And one thing, however, France will struggle with a little bit is my comment that 70% of your startups will fail. And this is a country that's not used to failure. And unfortunately, you know this with early stage startups, that 70% that's going to fail, maybe as much as 2/3 of them fail in the first 3 years. So your challenges as a venture capitalist, your ones that aren't going to make it occur quickly, and the ones who are going to make it take a longer time to play out. Your country has to understand that trade-off, and has to understand that merely because their children work at a startup doesn't mean they'll be millionaires. It does mean if they go across startups and continue to improve their skills, and you have the labor laws that allow people to move quicker as companies fail, that they have a much higher probability of having a household income of 2 to 3x what they would have had otherwise. So that's one of the things I think France will struggle with, and I think educating the population on becomes very key.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an honor to have you on stage. I'm sure you can stay around a few more minutes. Maybe if people want to ask more specific questions. In the meantime, please give us a big round of applause for John Chambers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Que la famille